We will provide regular updates. We will make sure all donations are directed towards supporting students, in particular affected by the earthquake. For this, the donations will be distributed among reputable NGOs and targeted projects based on the amount raised and the need at the moment. We will ensure that all expenses are publicly and transparently shared on our GoFundMe page. You could also find the donation box there and QR code on the box, including our Instagram page and GoFundMe page. And we are opening this pool of donations to start securing funds for the affected students. Primarily, we are fundraising to meet the long-term needs of students affected by the disaster. Long-term relief efforts can help rebuild and repair schools, provide necessary educational materials and resources, and offer psychological support for students who may be struggling with trauma and other challenges. The purpose of this is to help students regain a sense of normalcy and resume their education, which is crucial to their well-being in the long run.
We think that while immediate aid is critical for providing emergency assistance such as food, water, and medical care, we must commit to continually providing resources and assistance to those who have been affected by the disaster. This will enable them to recover from the aftermath and rebuild the communities that have been upended. In addition to immediate support, this donation campaign has been initiated to support projects and organizations that are being developed to address future needs of students who lost access to education due to displacement. To support this fundraising effort, we will be organizing student-led events that will contribute to the GoFundMe pool through cash donations. You can expect more follow-ups from us, so stay tuned. Your support is greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Hello everyone. My voice is hearable. Do you hear me? Now? Oh, that's too loud. Okay. Welcome everyone. We are having this meeting, of course, after quite a couple of weeks after the traumatic event, and we slightly shifted away from the immediacy of the context, and other things have popped up and other things have been experienced. But of course, just a day or a couple of days ago, I read from Twitter that even nowadays corpses are being found under the rubble. So the trauma is still there, and we will try to talk about it in a more mediated way, I will say, more theoretical, more cold-blooded way. I feel a little bit displaced in this environment for two reasons. First, I am in front of an audience who is predominantly Turkish speaking, so speaking English is a little bit destabilizing my mind. Secondly, of course, my expertise is on art criticism, contemporary art, and issues around that. And it's the first time that I will be talking about something else, moderating something else, something new. But we were also talking with Emre and Melih before this event, which is season 3 of Chromatic Wednesdays, episode 4. And the thematic is about upheaval, upheavals. So we were talking about it, that we said, I mean, even the average citizen has come into knowledge of the basics of economics, basics of, I don't know, or many departments of knowledge that have been forced itself to the daily life. So a 12-year-old kid can talk freely about the budget deficit in Turkey and things like that. So I am a little bit also representing this average citizen here. So what I can contribute is like, I expected actually a more international audience, so perhaps we have some people who are following us online, who might be out of the context of Turkey. But the things that I have prepared as a kind of intro was much more about, let's say, brief history of Turkey, let's say, basic trajectories which shaped up political mentalities and so on. Yeah, of course, art might have been also another topic, but I mean, I don't know my fellow artists or art critics or curators here present in the audience might also share my feeling of sometimes losing sense of professional interest in us in times of this kind of drastic dramas. So I will try to keep on this sobering moment in which everyone is concentrating on the physical reality of what happened. Of course, I mean, just briefly mentioning my interest or where I come from in terms of professional context. Contemporary art in Turkey have been predominantly about the political conflicts within the country in the last 20, 30 years. It is even sometimes being portrayed as over-political. So this, and this political engagement in the last couple of years have been also concentrating on the concept of memory. And this relates, of course, about the ruptures within the Republican history, a series of events, pogroms, genocides, conflicts, pressure on minorities and so on. My fellow artists and people like me are trying to fill up these gaps. And of course, memory has been one issue that we wanted to focus on. Of course, sometimes when you overwork this concept, you might also be coming across the accusation of culturalization of everything. But at the same time, of course, the neurotic kind of living in Turkey forces us to fill these gaps. But again, I'm going back to the kind of physical realities. The concept of memory is still might be functional, which in our conversation, I think it will be more clear what we remember, what we forget, what we choose to forget, what is the functions of these two things, keeping the memory or forget the mechanisms of forgetting in two of our contributors. These themes will also pop up, I presume. So I will try to give a little bit memory. Of course, you are all, as I said, familiar with the history, but we are in the centenary anniversary of Turkish Republic, and I over-contextualize things most of the time, but that was how I got the best grades in history classes. So when you do over-contextualization, the history teachers are liking you a lot. So I decided to start with the Turkish Republic. So the rupture and the destruction of the First World War, of course, dictated the young republic to work through the rubbles in metaphorical terms. So there was a need of state control, a central mechanism to decide what to do. An economy, I mean, just think about that it was the year 2022, 23, a couple of years after the Bolshevik Revolution. So the sense of statist politics and central planning was strongly defined in the initial years of the Kemalist Revolution. But very, very immediately afterwards, there was the sense that that the state will not be able to succeed in taking up the ultramodernism which defined the Republican ideology. So the state was quite central, but at the same time, slowly it gave a way in which the idea of creating a local national bourgeoisie started to establish. This kind of mixed economy idea got a little bit suspended during the Second World War. Of course, it was a kind of period of emergency and so on, but with the drastic change in 1950, with entrance into the NATO and the integration into the Western Bloc, shifting into the multi-party system and so on, things started to change. And of course, there was a new government which was conservative, pro-capitalist Democrat Party at that time. And towards, of course, the main arguments, the main traits of this new government was free market and entrepreneurship and this kind of we will create in every neighborhood a millionaire, her mahallede bir milyoner yaratma fikri. So the kind of centrality of public planning, the role of the state in economy, gave way towards more relaxation. Of course, as initial to the Republican Revolution, the sense of tabula rasa, carte blanche, starting from the scratch, happened again. But in this case, in the Democratic Party times, swaths of neighborhoods, old neighborhoods, gave way to highways. So it was also kind of a metaphor of a new ideology. And that kind of slowly started to create the political line in Turkey, left and right. So the left was much more regularism in dealing with the public affairs. The role of the state is pronounced and so on, whereas the more pro-business, the more pragmatic side somehow evolved into the right wing. And but at some point in the late 50s or 60s, both of the camps came together, and then they just assessed what was the situation, economic situation of the young republic. And so the task of, the double task of development and urbanization, a regular urbanization, seemed to be far-fetched. So it seemed like the sources was not enough to take both of these tasks. So the Turkish Republic chose industrialization. So, or how should I put it, prioritized industrialization. So there was a big inner migration of labor within the country. In the 60s and 70s, there was this kind of irregular solution of gecekondu, the slum houses for the newcomers, which solved the problem of everyone. The newcomer, the new worker had a new house. The state didn't have to bother about creating social houses, and the employer didn't need to think about, think about the social needs of these newcomers. But paradoxically, of course, this created a socialist backlash in the 70s, which was then quite drastically and bloodily interrupted by the military coup of 12 Eylül 1980, which gave way to the implementation of neoliberal politics. And this in turn created a deregulation, gradual, slow deregulation of central planning and statism and so on. Okay, I think I will cut some part of the whole thing, but so we can come to a more present situation. We will also come back to the more present situation, but I'll finish up with a slow touch on the political occurrences, which is called AKP, the Party of Justice and Development. So interestingly, I mean, apt to our context today, the government of AKP has been enabled by another earthquake. So 99 earthquake in the Marmara region created a kind of public disillusionment about the existing statu quo. So there was a hyperinflation, there was this kind of disappointment about the bureaucratic slowness and inefficiency and so on. So a party costumed itself as the new liberal promise, landed as the first party in the election at the expense of the whole collapse of the old parties. So there was suddenly a two-party situation in 2002, I guess, or one, I can't remember exactly. But anyway, AKP was actually at the right time, at the right place. Looking at the global context also, just remember 2001, September 11th happened, and there was this kind of war against the Islamic radicalism, and AKP's pro-capitalist, so-called liberal program was also bought by the Western Bloc, which kind of channeled its financial resources there. And also, globally speaking, in financial terms, there was the time of hot money. So people in the Western sphere was lending money to developing countries like Brazil, Argentina, and Turkey, which created an illusion of growth, an illusion of improvement of social situation. And of course, there were certain improvements in the initial years of AKP, but at the same time, it resided on an illusion. And so the whole narrative of success of AKP concentrated on development and growth, but at the same time, the knowledge, let's say the capacity of improvements in technology and industrialization stalled because of the lack of competency. So what was the solution, basic solution, which was experienced in places like Spain and some other places? Focus on construction industry. And and also in a very, very deregularized way. I don't need to talk about AKP's politics. If we go there, we will be stuck into it. But one-man system, nepotism, partisan choices, complete collapse of education, disembowelment of the whole state institutions, and became to a point in which, I mean, I will also include, we're going to talk about it. On one hand, we have these mega projects which are being defined as mad projects, ironically, çılgın projeler. Bahar will talk about the Channel Istanbul issue, I guess. But at the same time, the reality, of course, hit us with its own reality 2 years ago with wildfires along the Mediterranean coast, and now the earthquake in the southern and southeastern region of Anatolia. We have, I'm not an expert, as I said, I just chatted a little bit about what we all know. But I am relying on the expertise and knowledge of two friends. Müge Yazıcı has studied earthquake geology, and she also made researches on in Turkey, Mongolia, and I think her PhD, current PhD is about Chile. That might also pop up in the talk. And when we were preparing with Müge about what we will contribute, that we decided that it is perhaps much better to start from the very beginning, from the terminology. which are necessarily politicized in a way, which Müge will explain, but what is the functionality of geology? What are the basic definitions we talk about, but we are not fully aware of what we are talking about? And slowly, Müge will start from a more global, wider perspective, but towards the end, she will also cite about the past events that deal with Turkish specificity. Of course, I mean, the earthquake influenced also Syrian territory, but tonight, as people from Turkey, we are taking up the specificity of Turkey. Yeah, Müge.
Thanks, Erden, for introduction. So I will talk about the subjects in more general terms from like more geological aspects. And I want to start with some phrases that we commonly use in this kind of like events, actually, like natural hazards, disasters, but why I cannot move? Sorry.
In the meantime, I also have to add that Bahar Bayhan will be with us as the second contributor through internet. So she will be online after Müge's talk, and yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I will talk about more general geological aspects and general like 3 common phrases that we commonly use in our daily life to express this kind of like events, like natural hazards, disaster or natural disasters, and catastrophes. So by definition, natural hazards is a phenomenon or an event created by nature which creates damage or and the human which creates damage and the dangerous and likely causes the disaster, causes the damage in nature. So these are kind of like natural phenomenon created by nature, and these are kind of like events which mainly just occur by nature. But disaster, on the other hand, is a consequence of hazardous events that result in a great harm to people and properties. And catastrophe is much more bigger scale of disaster. So catastrophe and disaster actually as a consequences of a hazards, like natural hazards. So by definition, actually, because in last years we also used a lot of natural disaster, which is generally wrong usage of the term. Because if we use a natural disaster, so it means also in society, it means something else. So if you go more deeper to the disaster definition, it comes from the French and Italian word like disastre or disastro, which comes from the il start meaning. And United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction defines the disaster as a series of disruption of the functioning of a community or a society at any scale due to hazardous event interacting with conditions of exposure, vulnerability, and capacity, leading to one or more of these 2 following human, material, economic, environmental losses and impacts. So if we add natural as an adjective on the disaster, this misrepresents the formal meaning of disaster and lowers the sense of human responsibility, which might adversely affect the disaster preparedness and also enhance the fatalistic perception, so which is commonly actually used wrongly in Turkey. So this is, I will not go into detail because this is not my the specific subject, but the usage of the terms are really important for our perceptions. Because if you say natural disaster, so in Turkey we commonly say that this is doğal felaket, but it is not natural, actually. Disaster is not natural, so we have to take this really seriously. And so this is one illustration of a disaster, actually. This represents the 1755 Lisbon earthquake. So this is an illustration made after this earthquake. And this earthquake actually is really important, especially in Europe, because after this earthquake, the predictions, not prediction, but the preparation for the earthquakes are just changed a lot. And the people's perceptions and the city planning, everything started to change and put lots of regulations and politics in it. And today, these countries and in Europe, we have much more safe, better places to live for future generation. And especially also interestingly, after this earthquake, a year after this earthquake, Voltaire wrote a poem, actually, so you can see some part of it, as the dying voices call out, will you dare respond to this appalling spectacle for smoldering ashes with? This is the necessary effect of the eternal laws freely chosen by God. One day, all will be well. This is our hope. All is well today. This is the illusion. So this is still, we are asking and saying the same questions and same things. So it is writing in 1756. So just imagine how many years have passed, but some things didn't change. Some things didn't change. And this earthquake, actually, this is really important because also in ancient time, people believe that the earthquakes are the punishments given by God. Also with this poem and with this earthquake, people start to question it. But still, we are also thinking the same stuff, but also the natural disaster, also the misusing of these phrases, give us still the same sense of it is punishment, but it is not actually. So it is the reality, it is the truth. Earthquake is there, natural hazards are there, but it is the punishment is not given by God, it is just the politics. And if you look at the number of disaster per type, you will see the meteorological disaster are the highest percent. And if you talk about the earthquakes, you can see that it is just 7.8 or something like that, which seems low, but actually it is not. So this is one of the, actually the strongest earthquake ever measured in the history. So this is Valdivia earthquake in 1960 in Chile, and it was magnitude 9.5. So just imagine 9.5 earthquake just hit the Chile. And in this earthquake, I assume it was 2,000 people just died. So it was a really great earthquake, actually. I mean, in terms of the damage, it was really destructive. But at the same time, the countries like Chile took it seriously and then changed something in their politics. Also Tohoku in 2011 in Japan. It was magnitude 9 earthquake, and you can see this really dramatic pictures, actually, a ship on the house, because it was an earthquake and then a big tsunami just came. So this is really, really catastrophe. And in this earthquake and tsunami, actually, just 2,000 people died. And the main reason for that amount of the people that we lost, it is mainly tsunami, not the earthquake. So this country is also another earthquake, in 2010 in Chile again. So it was magnitude 9 or 8.5 earthquake hit Chile again and killed many people. But these countries took this kind of event seriously and then changed something in their regulations. They changed the city planning. They changed the earthquake precautions. And every kind of the strength of the buildings, all the kind of escape areas, they created this kind of areas. And now they have all big earthquakes, in Chile, in Japan, earthquakes around magnitude 8 or 9. This amount of earthquakes just, it is disaster, of course, but just because of earthquake, they don't lose that much, people. And why do we have earthquakes mainly? I also don't want to make it a kind of geology crash course, but I guess it is important to understand the main theory behind it. So I don't know if you know something about geology or earthquakes so far, but I will just give a really brief introduction and summary to you. So you can see the world map, and you can see some like red dots and different colors, etc. But you can imagine the Earth is kind of like Earth crust is divided into the pieces, and you can just imagine it is like a jigsaw puzzle. And these pieces are just moving towards or relatively to each other. Their direction and the velocity can differ from place to place. Some part they are like moving away from each other. In some part they are like coming to each other, and in some part they slide horizontally towards each other. And these are that we call plates actually, and they are moving on the Earth. And as they move, they create the earthquakes actually. And these red colors on this map shows the earthquake region and the plate boundaries. So as plates move, we have earthquakes, volcanoes, all these natural phenomena. But actually, this is also important because earthquakes or the natural phenomena or geological processes are not just like disasters. I mean, they are disasters because of the human interaction and the human constructions. But these are also the reasons for our evolution, actually, because without this phenomenon, these processes, our Earth will not be a place to live, actually. And in this part, so this is a fault, actually. As you can see, it's one of these like red dots here in Mongolia. It was in Mongolia. And you can see this, it's really, really long trace of this fault. And this fault is just from the 1905. So just imagine more than 100 years passed, but still it's traced there. So it means another thing actually, because there's no erosion, no sedimentation there, so it can just stay there since more than like 100 years. But these are also important to just understand the process behind it, because we are living in a dynamic Earth. So we have to know all these processes. But what is more interesting, actually, so if you look more detailed to the world map, so you can also see again, the plate boundaries which are depicted here, and the arrows shows the direction of the motion of each pieces. And all these reddish zones represents the earthquake and volcanic areas. So these are related with the plate boundaries. Everything is related with the plate boundaries on the Earth. But what is more interesting, when we add the megacities on this map, actually, so we do see a nice correlation. We see a lot of correlation, like the megacities are mainly built on the places where we have lots of earthquakes or volcanoes, or like, around plate boundaries. So why is it? So is it a coincidence? It is not a coincidence, actually. We are kind of like clever animals as well. And when you look at the other map, so these are a bit more detailed maybe, but just to understand, just to give you some kind of like information about the geology and the background of the geology. And this map just shows you the general copper mines of the world. And it is pretty much fits with the location of the megacities, actually. So all these places, actually, all these like settlements are like founded in the geologically important places. I think this is important to understand because we are like living in a kind of like risky and dynamic Earth. But it is not just like, the mines or minerals, but it is also the agriculture. Agriculture is also, give us the livable places. And also in terms of like geology, like the earthquakes or plate boundaries gives us like fertile landscapes, fertile lands for agriculture and everything. But also at the same time, you can also think about the mountains, because in the plate boundaries, we have mountains, we have volcanoes. You can also use these places as a kind of like natural defense barrier in history. So there are lots of like stories like that. All the settlements, all the cities, they have this kind of like background history in terms of geology. And also, if we look at, the western part of Turkey, so probably you all know the Aegean part of the Turkey, which is lovely beaches and lovely cities there, great for the summer vacation, but this is also really active in terms of geological process, in terms of earthquakes. And all these regions that you probably know, all these like meandering rivers and the grabens, are really condensedly settled places, but they are all limited by faults. All these meandering rivers, all these valleys are limited by faults. And this is the map that shows you the ancient cities in the western coast. Actually, to understand it, the settlement location have not changed much. So when we just look at one of these region, so this is the city of Aydın, for example. So this is just one example. But these valleys are just limited by faults. And there are a lot of ancient cities there as well. Like since ancient times, settlements location have not changed much, because these are also fertile places. Because of the fault activity, you can also have the water access with minerals, which are like really suitable for agriculture. So that's why, since ancient times, the settlements or people use this kind of like places to settle down, to create their like cities and live there, because they are risky places, but at the same time they are fertile and suitable for settle. So this is, for example, like an illustration of an earthquake at Sparta in Greece. So it is 464 BC. So you see, like in Turkey as well, all ancient cities have earthquake records. So nothing changed in terms of like the location of the settlement. So this is one problem. We can change the location, but actually, like in Turkey or this kind of like countries which has like really high seismic risk, so you don't have too much like options. But you can just change the infrastructure, you can change the politics, you can change the strength of the buildings, as Japan, Chile, or US did. So you can have much more safer places for future generations. So if you come to the Turkey, so I don't want to go into detail like the geology, the parts and the faults, but you can see it is just like there are faults everywhere. I mean, they are not all active maybe, or the periodicity of this fault are not so like fast, but you can see from the risk map of Turkey on the right side. So it is generally like located along two major faults. So the North Anatolian Fault and East Anatolian Fault. And also in the western coast, you have lots of like, all these valleys that I show you, they are depicted here as a red color because they are all bounded by faults. So earthquake risk is a significant concern in Turkey due to its location, because all these big faults are limited by the boundaries of the plates. So these are really important faults, especially the North Anatolian Fault, because they have really powerful force to produce really big earthquakes, which can create really tremendous damages to the cities. And you can see also the some of the historical earthquake actually, like these are magnitude bigger than 6 or 6.5 earthquakes. And you can see I started from 1930, and from 1930, like even almost like last 100 years, you have a lot of big earthquakes. So if you just talk about the memory, so in 100 years, a country have this amount of earthquakes, which are a lot actually. So it is not the reason to forget about the earthquake. So it is the collective memory should be there as a country, but it needs to just to talk about this and to memory this earthquake and to know the country as itself is a risky area. And you have to know about, what is geology, what is earthquake geology of the region, what are the risks, and just try to change the precautions for the earthquake. So due to high seismic activity in Turkey, earthquake preparedness and the response measures are critical, but we don't have that much measures actually. So this is our problem. Long-term strategies, which is really missing in Turkey, for reducing the future losses and aiding recovery from natural hazards needs to be included as a part of sustainable land use and for future generation. So I will, we can also mention about, the last earthquake that happened in Turkey, in eastern part of Turkey. So it located more or less in that region, and it was the sequences of earthquakes, and it give loss of damage to almost 10 cities, almost completely collapsed. So I don't want to talk about this earthquake too much because still we are in a sensitive time, I guess. But what I'm trying to tell you actually to give a sense, to understand what is geology, what geology can bring us, what we learn from geology. Because as studying geology, I studied earthquake geology in my master in the eastern part of Turkey. We can provide the location of the faults. We can provide the ancient or paleo earthquakes, the timing of the earthquakes. We can provide the periodicity of the earthquake. And then you can understand in which area you are in terms of risk assessment. So is it close by a coming earthquake or not? So you can just, make your strategy like urban planning or like construction strategies and all politics based on this kind of information. So this is actually, I found is really missing in Turkey, unfortunately, but I hope so we will talk about these issues much more in detail or much more frequently to understand exactly what is it. It is not just a disaster. I mean, it's disaster when it hits a city, which is not prepared, of course, but we should also understand this kind of processes gives us a really, I don't know how to say, really kind of big opportunity to live, because these are also not just in terms of earthquake, but whole geological processes are important for human to live in a country or in a world. So I can finish this part right now and give you the stage to Bahar or to Erden.
Yes, Bahar will respond to your presentation, which has a kind of dynamic of macro time as a perspective span, with a more, I presume, a more modern perspective. Mm-hmm. And Bahar has studied urban research and sociology at Mimar Sinan University, and she's a program coordinator in Mekanda Adalet, Center for Justice in Space. And I think similar to my take on historicization, she will start with referring to the precautions or the state kind of reactions towards natural disasters or hazards, as you put it. Yeah, Bahar.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for hosting today. And thank you for your presentation, Müge. I think it creates a good base for me. I wanted to focus on urban planning processes in Turkey context and what is the relation between disasters and urbanization. I want to start from basically definition of the natural disaster. In Turkey, there's a general perception that natural disaster is a fate and unavoidable. So the government even says that, tries to make us believe that, but why? I think we should keep separated the natural event and the cause of the damage, because natural event didn't cause damage naturally or normally. Of course, there's a link between those, but the cause of the damage is not only event itself. We need to question and reject this directly linear relation, I guess. The notion of natural disaster also implies that the capability of human is limited for coping with the disasters. This assumption also releases the governments from the responsibility. I want to give a quick example. After the 6 February earthquakes, the government said that we couldn't prevent the damage because the magnitude of the earthquakes was large for us to handle. I can give you another example. In a lawsuit about flood disaster, State Council said that the rains above the seasonal norms was a force majeure. The responsibility of the public administration depends on whether the rain is extreme or not. This approach only focuses on technical solutions and ignores the socio-political cause and effects. We can't deny that, of course, human activities, which turns the natural events into disasters. This is what anthropocene theory says, but we should be aware of that humanity is not a total of people like acting same together. Simply, there are sufferers and gainers. Who are these gainers, I will detail later. And urbanization is seen as one of the biggest causes of the disasters. While we question the urbanization, we should consider the historical background, because primitive settlements transformed into megacities in a very long period. As Müge explained, people settled on the lands where they can sustain their lives. But why these settlements turned into megacities despite the disaster risk? I will question the role of urban planning. After many disasters in the history, there were some efforts for emergency action and mitigation of damage step by step. In Turkey, after Erzincan earthquake in 1945, earthquake hazard map was prepared for the first time, and since then, within years, many laws considering the importance of the relation between geological investigations and city planning came into force. But after 1999 earthquake, the extent of the damage showed that there was something wrong in the planning process. And 20 years after the 1999 earthquake, despite all the plans and laws, we ask the same question after 6 February earthquakes. Why weren't cities planned as earthquake resistant? There are many reasons, I guess, but I will focus on urban planning, which is claimed to have a major role in mitigating the damage of earthquakes. Before starting, I would like to note that mostly I'm going to talk about the conflicts in the urban planning processes, but I don't want to mean that if urban planning works well, everything could be wonderful. I avoid fetishizing urban planning because in Turkey, urban planning discipline has its own problem. It still operates at a bureaucratic level. it doesn't consider participation and doesn't respond to the needs and problems of people. Urban planning in an ideal world, urban planning is a decision-making work, and that's why it is much more engaged with the political context, I guess. Plans can show us which parts of the city are suitable for development according to the geological maps. Besides that, city plans can show that what are the risks if the city continues to develop without control, and make decisions about how city can be developed considering the population projections. It basically provides a vision for a future rather than urgent decisions for the current situation. There's a planning hierarchy starting from upper scale to subscale. First, territorial planning decisions are taken, and then sticking to these decisions, you can go to subscale. Urban planning should follow the regional development strategies, but this hierarchy is disrupted for a long time, and city plans can be easily bypassed with the top-down political decisions. I want to give you an example. Müge, can you please start the slideshow? Okay, thank you very much. In 2011, Kanal Istanbul project was announced as an election promise of the AKP. It is called Mad or Crazy Project. They are planning to create an artificial canal parallel to Bosphorus. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Within the project scope, 286 hectares of residential areas are planned to be evicted, and residents plan to move to mass housing areas. On the two sides of the canal, new residential areas are planned to be built for 1.2 million people. The government called the project as New City. It is known that the project will cause many negative effects in the city, but in terms of the disaster risk in Istanbul, this project will split the geography, and at the middle part will turn into an island. So emergency action will be blocked. On the other hand, the New City project will increase the population. So the project is planned, even it wasn't a part of the Istanbul Environmental Plan. Istanbul Environmental Plan is known as Constitutional Law of Istanbul. The plan shows the natural borders, reservation areas, potential development areas. Istanbul municipality prepared the plan in 2006, and the plan put into effect in 2009. This plan was saying that Istanbul shouldn't expand to the north because all the natural resources in the city are in the north. Later, the government changed the plans lots of time. After the plan revisions and legislative changes, mega infrastructure projects such as Third Airport, Third Bridge, Kanal Istanbul were constructed and are still planning to construct, although they were not part of the Istanbul Environmental Plan. I think this is a great example of how planning process can be disrupted and manipulated. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. Why does the government insist on the realization of this project? What does it mean for Istanbul, where a major earthquake is expected? Especially for the last 20 years, cities in Turkey are changing in favor of construction capital by ignoring the disaster risks. Cities itself became a tool for the accumulation of capital. David Harvey, a Marxist economic geographer, theorized it as urbanization of capital. And as well, urban planning became unfunctional. From the government's point of view, creating investment opportunities much more important than mitigating disaster risks. There's a dramatic data about the number of the constructors. I think 2 or 3 years ago, there were nearly 450,000 constructors in Turkey, while there were nearly 3,500 constructors in Germany. You can imagine the system behind that by looking at these numbers, I guess. I must say that the government doesn't totally ignore the earthquake risk. They use the risk to create an opportunity for construction companies as well. After the Marmara earthquake in 1999, the government immediately took action to build earthquake-resistant buildings. They came up with the idea for transforming the earthquake risk areas. Especially Istanbul was the target. First, they picked the poor neighborhoods in the city center. New housing projects developed there, and they forcibly evicted the residents and moved to outskirts of the city, where they built mass housing blocks. When they opened the city center for the investment, they also constructed new housing projects in the outskirts. In 2012, the government enacted the disaster law. They declared some neighborhoods in Istanbul as disaster risk zones. Can you go to the next, please? Thank you. I think this is a short story of how scientific data can be manipulated in the political context. In 2002, Istanbul municipality made a study on a disaster prevention mitigation plan in Istanbul in cooperation with Japan International Cooperation Agency. They determined the disaster risk zones in Istanbul, and 10 years later, 2012, the Ministry of Environment and Urbanization declared some neighborhoods as a disaster risk zone. These two studies didn't match. Interestingly, the disaster zones declared by the ministry were the ones with the highest land rents. The red parts on the map are declared by the ministry, and the yellow ones are declared by the JICA. No one knows by what criteria risky areas are determined, but it is obvious that the gainers are the housing companies. I think we can stop the slideshow. After all these years, even though earthquake is a fact in Istanbul, people living in this city still have the same fear, and the city hasn't been prepared for the earthquake. it is obvious that the governments taking advantage of disasters and risk situation not only to adopt liberal economic policies, but also to strengthen its authority. This is conceptualized as disaster capitalism. After 6 February earthquakes, the government had the opportunity to rebuild the cities that were almost completely destroyed. The government used the word empty land for those cities, which has a great history behind. One day after the earthquakes, construction companies started to design the projects without any planning process because they don't need any steep plan. They just need empty land, of course. I will stop now and then we can discuss later, I guess.
I guess we a little bit mismanaged the time, so we are already 1 hour ahead. I mean, from our starting point. We had things to discuss in mind, but I don't know whether we will have time for this. Perhaps we'll just briefly mention of what we can add to what we already said. I mean, of course, thinking about why we forget. I mean, your presentation, Müge, was, of course, insightful, in which we see that people are buying risks because they are taking also advantages of these risks. I mean, just the correlation between earthquake and let's say, fertility in terms of mines and earth, because I mean, because of the earthquake, these metals or whatever come closer to the surface, and the earth becomes more rich in terms of texture, I guess. But of course, at the moment, in the present, in the contemporary world, we are also buying the risk. I mean, people are having a kind of perpetuating this illusion of enrichment by exploiting, plundering the nature. I mean, we see also not only in Turkey, but of course Bolsonaro's plundering of the Amazon region is completely a similar kind of thirst for, let's say, petty enrichment. You know, the lower classes also contribute to this plundering in the hope for bettering their conditions. So we also see another kind of aspect in this contact with nature, or let's say a reflection on what alternative could be in places in Turkey, for example, where the opposition runs the municipalities. I remember, I mean, probably most of the people are here voting for HDP. I remember a couple of years ago there was this kind of discussion about why the municipalities in the Kurdish region have not came up with an alternative, but perpetuating the same ugly social bloc type of, Toki type of aesthetics all the time, and couldn't create an alternative. And I mean, I'm from the Kadıköy part of Istanbul, around the Bağdat Avenue, and of course we see how the people, the sociology that define itself as the opposition or the more modern or whatever, came up with the solution to rebuild the buildings that they were living in, destroy the 3-4-story houses, and then kind of come up with 10, 15 story tall high rises. I mean, just very basically, pragmatically speaking, I was also I mean, I was living in an incredibly beautiful apartment building, built in '72, just before my birth. it was like a dream. I mean, architecturally speaking and so on, also socially. And I remember my 70 years old neighbor just willingly accelerated this rebuilding process because she wanted a jacuzzi in the bathroom and she wanted to have 2-car space in the park room, which was incredible. I mean, at the age of 70, I mean, even this kind of illusion of enrichment and luxury kind of paves the way towards this plundering and complicity, I will say. And what we wanted to talk about is, I mean, Bahar wanted to also put the question why we forget. There's always this kind of sense of preparation of directions and whatever, but something also amnesiac situation recurs all the time. Perhaps you can a little bit talk about it, or if you want to add something to your talk or our conversation. We also briefly wanted to give a kind of global perspective, a comparative analysis. We even wanted to talk about the city we are right now in, Berlin, its geological situation, and so on. But I don't know if, I presume we don't have the time. But if you want to add also something, perhaps Müge can start again with a slight addition to the conversation, and then after Bahar, we also will turn into Q&A with the audience.
Okay, so I mean, I cannot talk about much more in terms of like architecture, but like in general, like changing the not open. Okay, so changing the type of the architecture in the cities are crucial for the the earthquake or any kind of like natural hazard assessment. But in countries like Turkey, all this like the changing, like the transition of the cities, which transition from the old version to the much more like safer places in terms of like natural hazards, are not based on the scientific facts actually. So this is for me, this is the main reason, especially like countries like Turkey, because we are not taking science seriously, and actually we don't understand what is science, especially the natural sciences, because they have like completely different point of view. Because for example, like when we are talking about the earthquakes, we are talking about really long time interval, and it doesn't affect your own life, but it is kind of like just important to set an idea. It will affect the future generation. For example, the last earthquake that happened in the southeastern part of Turkey. So the earthquake before it happened 2,000 years ago. So of course, like 2,000 years ago, it was completely like different environment, different settlements. But it seems really long time interval, 2,000 years, yes, but it hit us, So this is kind of like, what I can say as a geologist, we can give this kind of like information, we can provide this information to the governments, to the public, and also as a, the person or as a citizen, we have to know about these facts to understand where we are living in terms of like natural hazards, and we have to also construct our buildings, because like in Turkey, probably state doesn't help too much to the the people. Also, like after the earthquake, people trying to rescue themselves. There was no any state institution there actually. So we have to know as individuals about this information, and also have to change in our minds and try to use like our like forces maximum to change the places that we are living on, I would say. Bahar, do you want to add something?
Yes. I remembered that one of the famous geologists in Turkey, Cenk Yaltırak, said on TV, did I do this research to take it to the grave? I mean, who use these research investigations, and even it is used. I think this is a mind-blowing question. Earthquakes affect in Turkey. We must face it, but people tend to ignore even they saw the consequences. What is the motivation behind this denial? I don't think that we can blame people. On TV again, I watched an interview which is made with a woman survived after earthquakes. Her house was just above the fault line, and she was saying that we didn't know. We are not disaster experts. Can we put the responsibility on their shoulders? We should understand that it is a perception that constructed in time. The governments don't want us to remember. Otherwise, they need to take the responsibility. And their immediate action after the earthquakes, of course, getting back to normal. This is how we forget, I think.
Yeah, and I guess maybe people can or like should forget it to live it, because all the earthquakes, like big earthquakes, are kind of like traumatic disasters, and people maybe they need to forget it to live it, but the governments and the politics shouldn't forget it. So this is the problem for me. Like this is, I don't know if it's working.
Yeah, I think we can also open it to the audience, whether there are some comments, additions, questions. Yeah.
So my question is, I think, both Müge and Bahar. So when we think about what to do next in Turkey, for Istanbul earthquake, let's say we are expecting, approximately 20 million people are living there, and when we think about the especially center part is quietly, densely populated, old buildings, no budget. I don't want to draw a negative line, but how did Chile, for example, achieve not to have, disastrous outcomes at the end of a big earthquake? Do we need to take like harsh precautions, or do we need a very strong political power who wants to change things? Because when you think about, when you hear about the talks, what we're gonna do with the people if we need to renew the whole city or the whole infrastructure, like how it's gonna work at the end? Yeah.
I mean, from geological point of view, I would say it is a difficult case, like in Istanbul, because it's highly populated. And so we knew like the Istanbul earthquake is coming up, still is like, coming. But like, I guess like in terms of geology and the city plan, so all infrastructure should change somehow. But it also, the matter of like the economy and the people who are living there. So everything is just like, raises the much more like questions. But I would say the all infrastructure should somehow like change, because we have to change the construction regulations. Because in Istanbul, I don't know, like there was like 50,000 apartments or buildings, more or less. Like they are completely, weak for the earthquake. So how we can deal with it? So it's a really big problem. And actually, I don't know. Like I can just say in terms of like geology, but after 99 earthquake, this is all known actually. So we had like 20 years to change something, but what is changed? I don't know. So it is another problem of politics or the government.
Bahar?
Actually, I don't have a quick answer to that, but after 6 February earthquake, there was a perception that the only responsible for the damage was the constructors and their poor construction techniques. The government emphasizing the importance of the earthquake resistance building techniques. This approach makes people think that the earthquake-resistant building and earthquake-resistant livable cities are same thing. I don't think it is. There is a general perception that we are safe as long as the buildings are not collapsed. This perception also reduces the urban planning into engineering service. I think the problem is much more engineering. One of the biggest problems is corruption. For example, the city council, which approves changes in city plans, consists of constructors. There is lack of public control. So what we're dealing today is much bigger than to making the buildings according to the law or making the buildings safe. I don't know.
Well, at least in the short term, we know what to change. In a couple of weeks' time, we will have some say. And of course, there are some models that have been successful in other geographies. So things can be changed, I guess, through more reflection on how the cities should be shaped. Another question or comment?
Thank you for the presentations. Regarding to your question, I would also like to ask something. As a city planner, I feel really stuck actually because we all don't know what to do next. Would it be possible to give us some concrete examples, or is it possible to connect cities to Chile and Istanbul or somewhere maybe?
I mean, I also don't know about the city planning or the construction strategies that change in Chile and Japan, because it is not my area. But what I can say, it is also like a bit different, because like, for example, in Chile or in Japan, type of earthquakes are different than Turkey, but it doesn't mean that they can do it there, but we cannot do it in Turkey. It is not like that. So we can also do it in Turkey, but it is kind of like the problem with the civil engineering and construction probably, because you have to change something, because like in Japan they have like magnitude 9 earthquake, but still they don't have collapsed buildings. So it can be done. We don't have this kind of like the regulation, unfortunately. But what I can say is a personal impression. So I don't know the details, but as a personal impression when I was in Chile actually. So I just saw this country is not corrupted that much. I mean, like you can just feel it like in every different part of the the area that you are working on. So even when you are talking with the people, so I actually like didn't expect it that much. So it is like my bad, to be honest. But then like what I realized, like the people are taking like many regulations so seriously, which is completely missing in Turkey, I guess. Like. People are trying to find the easiest way always in Turkey. This is the corruption. And if you don't have this, and if you have a really good regulations after like big earthquakes or big natural hazard, it is not, oops, there is one. Okay. Share. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I would say as a personal experiences, this is the the corruption, but I don't know the regulation in terms of like civil engineering or city planning.
Bahar, will you comment on it? Or?
Okay. I don't want you to depress you, but nothing can be changed like this. I think what we can do for future is forcing the institutions to take the responsibilities. I guess that there's a I guess citizen control is a key point there. We should be aware of what's going on in the city. We need to demand to participate in the processes. We can't wait to some urban planners or politicians to change the cities for our own good. So we need to take the control, I guess. This is what we quickly change in the process. This is how.
Yeah, to increase the public responsibility. Any more, or shall we come to a close? I think there's one more.
Hi. So I actually want to ask something more regarding to urbanism, actually, because specifically talking about the case of Turkey, the big cities actually always influence this idea of urbanism into the rural areas. So when we look at, for example, Kahramanmaraş, Malatya, Hatay, like all the small cities that was affected by the recent earthquakes, they were actually always influenced by specifically Istanbul, but also Izmir and Ankara. Like the big cities actually always influenced the life, like the urban life, the urban construct, like urban. It's and specifically talking about like the city landscape. They like the last 20 years of construction in Turkey in small areas. They also want to have like a big so-called skyscrapers with like the 10, 15 like floors. So I want to know like, could it be possible if a rural space's urban understanding of urbanism could influence something like a mega city? So what I feel like this, for example, my question is actually this, like, what can we learn from this in the more rural spaces as understanding of the urbanism and redesigning the city's landscape? And how could this actually influence a big city like Istanbul or Izmir, which are also on the earthquake zone? I think I actually want to know if you, for example, know anything like a historical background, if something similar happened, or have you learned something from the 99 earthquake that influenced the landscape of Gölcük or like the Adapazarı at all, or we just did what we always do, like build, buildings. So.
Is it for Bahar?
Yeah, it's more like Bahar. It's understanding of the city landscape, to be more specific.
It's a hard question, I guess. I need to take take a few minutes to answer that.
Maybe I can just contribute in terms of like earthquake geology, especially like in Chile. For example, like when I was in Chile, I had an earthquake. It was a small earthquake. I mean, small, it's a magnitude 6.5 or something like that. And like Chile, it's all along the coast. And all the big cities have really high buildings, like skyscrapers. And I was like one of these buildings, and like 10th floor or something like that. So it was like safe. I mean, I don't know in terms of like city planning, but you can also construct this kind of like, the buildings which are like, the safe in terms of earthquake or this kind of like natural disaster hazards.
I don't know if you are familiar with the discussions in Turkey, but for a long time, the minister, Recep Tayyip Erdoğan is saying that horizontal architecture is important because the skyscrapers are not safe for the earthquakes, etc., etc. But it is questionable because we can say that if we build the houses low story or with the gardens as as maybe as an example of American banlieues. This is a solution what they provide about the earthquake-resistant cities. I don't think that there's a. I think it's change in the political context. What they want to do is direct the capital in the zones what they created, I guess. If they wanted to influence the horizontal architecture, etc., I think there are some reason behind that. I don't think that these plans are for the people, for the needs of people, expectations of people. I don't think these plans are long-term and based on specific investigations. It's just political, I guess.
And appallingly, they already fixed the constructors after only a couple of weeks after what have been went through. Most of the contracts have been already set without any negotiation with the people, and so on. Shall we end? Okay, thank you for coming. Thank you for your patience. Thanks for listening. And let's meet for the next episode of Chromatic Wednesdays.
Thank you very much.